Believe it or not, Major League Baseball has a television dilemma. There's been some reporting recently about ESPN perhaps leaving its contract to broadcast Major League Baseball games. This was first reported on February 6, 2025 by The Athletic, citing an anonymous source. ESPN's current MLB contract lasts through 2028, but the question is whether ESPN will walk away from the 2026 through 2028 seasons. Well, when we look at the numbers, we'll see that they're not huge, but of course they are still significant. According to the article, ESPN currently pays MLB about $550 million per year for its broadcasts, a lot more than, say, Apple or Roku. Now, this is less than the $729 million per year that Fox reportedly pays MLB, a number that kind of helps put this deal in perspective. Meanwhile, TBS pays about $535 million per year to MLB for its contract, which is just about the same as ESPN. Yeah, if you're like me, you probably didn't know all these figures before. There was once a time where we could have kept all this stuff in mind and where these numbers were all over the newspapers, but in the modern day, these numbers are so huge and they're so silly and out of proportion to what most of us experience that they're basically meaningless. Well, to give you an idea, let's take a look at the top 10 Major League Baseball salaries per Spotrac.com. The Fox deal pays for the top 2 of these payrolls, we could say. The ESPN deal maybe for 2 more, and the TBS deal might cover 2 more after that. So that's like maybe 6 or 7 teams out of 30? So now, yeah, you kind of get an idea of what those numbers mean in real terms. So, I don't know, maybe it's actually a good thing for this deal with ESPN to end and for a new one to rise in its place. After all, the real money in baseball has for a long time now been in local media, not national media. And in truth, that's actually where Commissioner Manfred has had his sides. Coming off the back heels of the disastrous collapse of the old regional sports networks, the commissioner is hoping to create a centralized system for all local media rights. The idea here appears to be to have Major League Baseball determine the value of all local media right packages and then to pool the revenue to divide it evenly among each team. There are, however, a number of barriers that stand in his way. The biggest barrier, though, is almost certainly the one in Los Angeles. Yeah, it's no secret, the Los Angeles Dodgers do have the most impressive salary in the sport, and there's no secret that the luxury tax scheme and the revenue sharing scheme has done absolutely nothing to prevent that from happening. The current setup is actually the worst nightmare for fans, and I would argue even for players. And to understand this, we really need to take a step back in history and take a look and see how this all unfolded. Well, you see, back in the good old days, television was actually seen as a threat to baseball. The thinking back then was that fans would rather watch games on television than go out to the ballpark. In the late 1940s, this was especially concerning owners who worried that fans would rather watch the more famous players on television than go to their local teams. And so this led to some really odd newspaper pages like this one from the Sporting News on June 9, 1948. As you see here, attendance was up, but television threatened to pull attendance way down. Well, in hindsight, we now know that those fears were completely ridiculous. Baseball, like other sports, should have embraced the new technology and not just run away from it. This is because teams, believe it or not, can make more money, a lot more money, from baseball broadcasts than they ever could from gate receipts. Now, the golden age of baseball and television was clearly the early 1960s. In fact, in 1960, NBC, CBS, and ABC all had contracts at the same time, and it was common to see 3 or more live broadcasts on a single Saturday. That sounds a lot like the NFL's television deal, right? You're on 3 different stations at once, and you have the stations competing with each other, and you're making huge amounts of money, in theory, from all 3. Well, that setup didn't last very long. You see, the people who run Major League Baseball have this habit of shooting themselves in the foot. In early 1966, Major League Baseball signed an exclusive contract with NBC for the rights to broadcast baseball. This was the beginning of the monopoly era, the bad old days of baseball on national television. Though it's since gone down the memory hole, there were at the time certainly people who recognized that the exclusive contract seemed to be a little bit low for the product that baseball was selling. Well, this was back in the good old days, back when the World Series was still a national event. Back in those days, there were school teachers who would bring television sets into the classrooms to let the students watch the World Series games live. Sadly, though, it took years for baseball to finally realize just how valuable the broadcasting of his sport really is. Well, it wasn't until the famous 1975 World Series that the drawing power of baseball's postseason games in the evening really became known. There is a reason why Carlton Fisk's famous home run in Game 6 is so fondly remembered. This really was the turning point for baseball on national television. And it just so happens that Major League Baseball had a brand new, shiny national primetime show to offer viewers the next year. This was its contract with ABC for Monday Night Baseball. So this is basically the glory days of baseball's national television contract. This is the time of Camelot. This is back before the dark times. But what you have to remember is that baseball teams also had local television contracts at the same time. At least some teams did. And some of those local deals turned into national deals. Well, I bet you already know both of these examples. WGN, which had aired the Chicago Cubs for decades, became a nationally distributed cable television station in 1978 and rode the wave of cable television's popularity. The Cubs, in other words, became a national team. And meanwhile, the Atlanta Braves on TBS became a national team in 1979. In fact, in the early 80s, owner Ted Turner aggressively marketed them as America's team. So, by the time I was a kid in the early 1990s, anybody with cable television could watch practically every Braves and Cubs game, not to mention some games on other channels. It was baseball heaven. Well, it was heaven, that is, if you happened to have cable television. You see, Camelot didn't last very long, and once again, it's the baseball owners that have themselves to blame. You see, when CBS bought the national contract in 1988, for a total of $1 billion, this was absolutely huge news. It looked to observers at the time that CBS had nothing to lose and everything to gain from this deal. But if you read the fine print, you'll start to realize that this deal might not have necessarily been in the best interests of the sport. So I know this sounds strange, but clips like this are actually kind of rare. There are not a ton of tapes out there of CBS Game of the Week broadcasts, and the reason why is because there weren't a lot of game broadcasts to begin with. CBS spread its games of the week out over the course of the season and didn't really air anything with consistency. In other words, you might have one Saturday with a game and then 2 weeks off. I remember this period, and this was a huge problem for me, right? In 1990, I was like 6 years old. I was a baseball-obsessed kid, and I never knew when there were actually going to be games to watch on television. And worst of all is the fact that my family at the time didn't have cable, which meant that I couldn't watch WGN or TBS or ESPN. And so the only baseball fans that really benefited from the explosion of games on cable television were the ones who could afford those packages. What's worse, CBS was responsible for giving us Sean McDonough, who I still consider to be the worst World Series announcer of all time. And yes, I know this means worse than Joe Buck, who I also find insufferable. McDonough, of course, was a huge shock to the baseball public. Remember that only 10 years earlier, we had enjoyed the legendary Vin Scully. And yes, the announcer does matter, no matter what the sports journalist will tell you. Well, the CBS experience was horrible, simply awful, and if you don't believe me, go back and watch some of the games. But the worst was really yet to come. You see, Major League Baseball's greatest weakness is also its greatest strength. This would be the 162-game schedule, baseball's greatest asset and its greatest liability. Though it's extremely poorly written, this Wikipedia article on the history of MLB on ABC hits the problem right on the nose. ABC's contract with baseball in the 1970s and 80s featured only a handful of regular season games that the network had to broadcast. You see, ABC was interested in the postseason, which is where the ratings were, not in the regular season. Nobody was watching regular season games, and ABC didn't want to sacrifice its normal programming in the evening for the sport. And so, even though many of us have fond memories of the traditional NBC Game of the Week, we need to remember that the ratings were actually pretty bad. They were certainly bad enough that NBC was not willing to pay what CBS was offering. Now, the reason that ratings were bad is pretty simple. It's because those regular season games don't matter. They don't matter for two reasons. Reason number one is because a long season means that any individual game will likely not have a huge impact on the pennant race. There is an exception to that if you have a game like in September between two teams that are competing, or if you have a situation where one team is collapsing, that sort of thing, right? But for the most part, individual games are not really that important. Reason number two is that the expanded postseason cheapens the regular season. 12 out of the 30 teams made the postseason in 2024. That included the Kansas City Royals and Detroit Tigers, who barely finished above 500. And though most of us didn't really watch it, the 2020 postseason featured a whopping 16 teams, more than half the teams in the sport. It was just like the Stanley Cup playoffs. Naturally, this leads you to wonder what the point of playing 162 games is if you're going to just have 4 rounds of playoffs in the end. Well, that's another problem. Expanding the postseason might attract television deals, and we all know that television networks and advertisers love baseball in October. But the problem is that it also floods the market with postseason games, and believe it or not, fans, like me, get really tired of this stuff. Well, and all of this leads us up to the Baseball Network, which is by far the biggest disaster in the history of baseball on television. You see, CBS, and Sean McDonough in particular, was so bad that fans just stopped watching the sport. Both ABC and NBC were sore at Major League Baseball for leaving them in the dust, and so Major League Baseball came up with the Baseball Network experiment to create its own network where no network would step in. Well, when you look closely, you'll realize that the Baseball Network was always doomed to fail. The money simply was not there, the ratings were not there, and the idea of dividing a few regular season broadcasts into regional telecasts was just simply bad. Now, the most ridiculous part of all is that the Baseball Network didn't even start broadcasting until July 12, 1994, which was the day of the All-Star Game. Well, they didn't have much time to show any of those games, did they? The players went on strike less than a month after that, and that was it for the 1994 season. Now, if you watched it, and I know most of you didn't, but if you watched it, you would know that the 1995 World Series was split between ABC and NBC. This is because baseball couldn't convince either one of the networks to take on every game of what should have been its crowning moment, the World Series. That's how much trouble the sport was in 1995. Now, I'll admit this, I'm a purist and I've never really been a fan of Fox's approach to baseball. However, I have to admit that Fox has been very good for the sport. In fact, if it were not for Fox, baseball would likely have been a cable-only sport in the late 1990s and might never have had a national television contract at all. Meanwhile, in the wake of the strike, a series of regional sports networks bloomed across the country, which replaced the traditional over-the-air channels and turned baseball into a cable-only sport. And the amazing thing is that these channels succeeded even though their predecessors largely failed. Anyway, all of that leads us to where we are today. But what about ESPN and baseball parting ways? And what about this regional sports network concept? What can we expect to see in the future? Well, to answer that question, you need to understand first that the failure of the regional sport network system is actually a great bonus for Major League Baseball. You see, those television contracts are the reason for the salary discrepancy in the sport, and the tradition does go back to WGN and TBS. So if you can solve that problem, the TV contract problem, you will likely solve the competitive balance issue. And you know, I'm serious about this. Baseball really does have a competitive balance problem. Expanding the postseason only obfuscates the issue. The real problem is that the same team has been the best team in the regular season for 8 years in a row. That would be the Dodgers. Commissioner Manfred's challenge will be convincing the owners that they're better off working together than competing. The truth is that they really do need each other, but they don't necessarily understand that. And as far as ESPN is concerned, well, it's not like ESPN has been airing a ton of games over the past few years anyway. You know, my understanding is that most fans who actually watch them dislike ESPN's broadcasting style. I sure know I don't watch it. Okay, in terms of the future, I'm certain that MLB will continue its relationship with Fox and likely also with TBS. The big question here, though, is whether the commissioner can come up with a plan that takes the regional discrepancies out of the television contracts, and I'm talking about the local contracts. If he can pull that one off, and if he can get it so that the commissioner's office has control over all these contracts and that all the revenue is pooled, I would be convinced to forgive him for all of his sins, including the stupid Ghost Runner. But there's still that pesky problem of the ridiculously expanded postseason, which is a problem that unfortunately is a little bit hard to solve. The legendary old days of the September collapses are simply whispers from the past. Unfortunately, we will likely never experience anything quite like, say, 1964 again. Now, of course, we can always replay those seasons using our Sims and then imagine what might have been. Well, as far as I'm concerned, replays are a lot more interesting when you cut out the ridiculous expanded postseason and just have the World Series between the best team in both leagues. But then again, I might just be an old guy. Now, I do think, though, that at some point in time, Major League Baseball needs to decide whether it's going to have an expanded postseason or a long regular season, because you really can't have both. There is a good solution somewhere in the middle. And hey, maybe it takes getting rid of ESPN for them to finally figure this out.